To open the Property Pages dialog box for a report project, go into Solution Explorer and right-click on the project name and select Properties. That opens up this Property Pages dialog box. Now this is a brand new project, and so it currently contains all of the default values for the project properties. Now the only property that you have to set before deploying reports is the target server URL, because that identifies the server where you want to deploy the report to. Most of the other deployment properties are preset to default locations, but you can change those to customize how your reports are organized on the server. Remember that you have a lot more flexibility in how you structure the folders on your report server than you do within an individual report server project. So all of the properties are grouped into build, debug, and deployment properties. The build section configure a couple of things when the data tools builds the report project. Error level sets the severity level of build violations to report the problem as an error. Any violations greater than the value you set here appears as a warning, and deployment can proceed. The values range from 0 to 4, with 0 the most severe error, and 4 a minor issue. 2 is the default, and it's a pretty reasonable value in most situations. And then the output path is the path where Data Tools stores report definition and other project files when you build or deploy a project, or preview a report. So that's on the local machine here. And so the default is bin/debug, as it is with most Visual Studio projects. Now it's important to understand that neither of these build properties or their values affect report deployment. These are only going to affect how the project is built locally here within SQL Server Data Tool. Okay, then there's the debug section. This has one property, start item, which specifies which report in the project should execute when you use the Start Debugging option in Visual Studio. The drop-down list is going to contain a list of all of the reports that are currently defined within the solution. I only have one, report 1, and so that's the only option there. If I add additional reports, they'll be listed there. So this is a bit analogous to a web forms project, where you can select which .aspx file is going to execute when you hit F5 within Visual Studio. It doesn't affect anything about the report after deployment. Nothing about the behavior of the report or anything. It's only a setting that you use when developing reports using Data Tools. Okay, then the last section is deployment. Now, the build and debug properties provide a few useful development options for the report projects, but you'll need to give some attention to at least some of the deployment properties. As I mentioned before, you'll need at the very least to specify the URL for the report server where you'll deploy the reports, using the target server URL property. But there are several properties here that affect deployment. Overwrite datasets and overwrite data sources determine the deployment behavior when your project defines shared datasets or shared data sources. In either case, if the report server contains a dataset or data source with the same name and deployment location as defined in the project, then these settings determine whether the existing item is overwritten on the server at deployment. The default is set to false to prevent overwriting existing items in the case where you reuse the data source or dataset across multiple projects. Now use caution if you set either or both of these properties to true, because you'll be overwriting things on the server. Then there are various target object folder properties. These identify the folder on the report server where the specified type of objects are deployed. For datasets, data sources, and report parts, these are typically folders that contain the components shared across multiple reports. You should use a standard naming scheme across the enterprise to make it easy to find relative components. You can certainly use project-specific locations if you want to, though. And there could be good reasons for grouping functionally related groups of the same type of components in different folders. You'll get a deployment error if a data source or dataset already exists on the server, depending on the overwrite datasets and overwrite data sources property settings. I talked about those a moment ago. Now, the target report folder is a little bit different. Data tools won't treat as an error the situation where a project report of the same name exists at the specified location on the report server. Instead, it'll automatically overwrite the existing report. The default value of this property is the project name, so unless you change the property value, you'll end up with a separate report folder for each report project that you create that deploys to the same report server. That may or may not be what you want. If you have a lot of different report projects, all of which contain very closely related reports, on the server you may want to put those in the same folder. But you have the flexibility to do it on a project-by-project basis, whatever you decide is best for your environment. And one thing to note here is that there isn't any overwrite report or overwrite report part properties. So you can't control the behavior when there are existing reports or report parts on the report server with the same name. Okay, then there's target server URL. I talked about that. That's the destination report server for the project and the only property that you're required to set or change before deploying a new report project. And if a target folder location doesn't yet exist on the report server, then the deployment process will create it for you at that URL. All right, then there's target server version. This property essentially lets you specify the version of SQL Server installed on the report server that you specify for the target server URL property. But what this property actually does is to determine the version of report definition language, or RDL, that it'll use for the report files. This means that you want to make the right choice here. But the correct choice isn't necessarily immediately obvious. So if I use the drop-down arrow here, you can see that I only have three possibilities: SQL Server 2008, SQL Server 2008 R2 or later, and detect version. Now keep in mind that I'm using reporting services that was installed with SQL Server 2012. SQL Server 2012 isn't listed here, but it turns out that it uses the same structure RDL as SQL Server 2008 R2. So that's the default, and that's what I'm going to want to use here in my environment. And that also applies to SQL Server 2014. But then otherwise, if you're deploying to SQL Server 2008, you want to make that selection so that that version of reporting services understands the RDL within the report definition files. Okay, alternatively, you could set the target server URL and then select detect version. And that immediately contacts the report server and sets the appropriate value for you. And if you haven't yet set the target server URL, as I haven't here, then you'll just get an error saying that the property isn't set, or if it has a problem connecting to the server, you'll get an error to that effect as well. Okay, now be careful if you deploy a report to a SQL Server 2008 or SQL Server 2008 R2 report server, but use SQL Server 2012 or later report features. Okay, now to take a step back, what I mean is that if I'm actually using SQL Server 2008 or its R2 variation, but I use SQL Server 2012 report features because there's new report features introduced with SQL Server 2012, then in that case you want to be careful. Because in some situations, data tools will remove components from a report that aren't supported on the target server before deploying the report, which makes sense. It's not supported on the destination server, so the report isn't going to be able to do anything with it. The moral of that story is that you always want to design to the version of SQL Server reporting services where you'll be deploying the report. There is backwards compatibility, but for the most part, if you're going to migrate forward, you're probably going to want to revisit your report definitions and update them to the newest version. Visual Studio has long had the ability to save multiple project configurations, each with its own set of project property values. This feature has a variety of uses for the many kinds of projects that you can create using Visual Studio. In a report project, you could use this feature to change the target report server for each configuration. For example, for the debug configuration, you could set the target server URL to a report server on the local machine. But for the release configuration, set it to a test or a production server. And you could specify different target folders for the various report objects to conform to the target report server. All right, here I am back in the property pages, and I can select this drop-down list, And as you can see, a new report server project has 3 predefined configurations: debug, debug local, and release. This active debug selection indicates the current configuration setting for the project, making that configuration easy to get to. But otherwise, these 2 selections are going to display and use the same property values. This All Configurations option lets you set properties for all configurations defined in the project all at once. Initially, it shows the values for properties that are the same across all configurations that you have defined. And then this Multiple Configurations option lets you select which configurations you want to display and modify properties for. Alright, so as you move around the different options here, the different property values are going to change based on what is set for those different configurations. And as you can see, really the only thing that's changing is the output path. Because for the release version, I'm going to go into the release subfolder of the bin directory. Alright, I'll go back up to Active Debug. You can also create your own custom configurations, which is very handy in report server projects when you need to deploy to multiple servers, such as the local machine for development and debugging, a test server, and a production server, or any number of configurations. So if you click the Configuration Manager button here, it opens up this dialog box. And from here, you can modify existing configurations or create new ones. And you can see the different active ones there. There's an option for a new. You can edit a configuration and have complete control over the configurations that you use for this report server project.